Welcome to Inspired Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Okay, welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change. Now, I want to start this podcast with an observation that I've been making. It's been happening for a long time, and I keep having to come back to it, and in part, it makes me feel frustrated. And that is the issue about how men react to the idea of feminism. And it's not just men. There's certain women who also react against feminism. And for me, I'm always a little bit puzzled about this particular phenomenon, because in my view, essentially, the question arises, why would there not be a sense or a driving towards change in our society where men and women are perceived equal? Now, the interesting thing with that is that there's a lot of rhetoric out there about, what feminism is about, what equality is about. And I'm going to keep it really, really simple. And essentially, the issue about feminism can be summed up into one position, and that is that women should have equal access to resources and opportunities regardless. They also need to be allowed to participate economically and in the decision-making politically. And that we also value different behaviours, aspirations, and needs in a similar way to each other. And again, one of the things that I talk about in terms of gender issues is that men and women are different. But that doesn't mean that there should be a difference in equality, that we can have the same rights and award the same rights towards each other. Now, for whatever reason, and I've got a myriad of answers to this, really, and I always get challenged, and the one name that keeps coming up is Jordan Peterson. I want to delve a little bit in the next 15 minutes into some of my thoughts around this. So firstly, I want to make it very clear that as a father of a daughter and as a grandfather of a granddaughter, there is absolutely no question in my mind that I wanted my daughter and I want my granddaughter to be able to have the same or similar opportunities that men in our culture have. Now, this is where we start to run into one of the primary problems, because one of the arguments against feminism is that men are in crisis because of the feminization of society. Now, think about this. All right. So, in one of the podcasts, or in several of the podcasts, I've talked about the issue of accountability. Now, why is it that we as men set out to blame women for our own experience in the context of society, when we've actually set the tone for virtually 10,000 years about how society works and who gets what, where and when? It strikes me as being almost nonsensical. Okay? So, the way that we can understand anti-feminism in a way is that it rejects at least three general principles in feminism. Firstly, that social arrangements among men and women are neither neutral nor divinely determined. Secondly, that social arrangements amongst men and women favour men. That there are collective actions that can and should be taken to transform these arrangements into more just and equitable arrangements, such as those in the timelines of the women's suffragette and other rights. So again, here's the rub. the anti-feminism movement, and there is a movement, there's no question about it, and it's not just men who rally against feminism, it's women also, is that they reject one or more of those propositions, those principles. Now, if you want to think about this a little bit more in depth, it raises the question of why should we see the other gender as not having access, as not being equal, as also then being to blame for our own ills, for the ills that men perceive that they experience. And I'm the first one to put my hand up and go, mate, as men, we're not traveling well, but we also need to take accountability for having set up, generated, and maintained a system that actually is toxic to our own existence, to our own being. And when I talk about in my book, Making Good Men Great, Surfing a New Masculinity, is that traditional masculinity rests on four values: being territorial, being hierarchical, being acquisitional, and being competitive. So our well-being, by definition, in that set of values, operates on the basis that someone else has to do not so well. But ironically, this whole system's flipped over. We are the ones that have suffered at the hands of, and let's call the spade a spade, patriarchy. And again, I'm going to get nailed by trolls about, how I'm sort of abandoning, deserting men, and that I'm a traitor to the masculine cause and so on. I don't accept any of that. My principle as a human being, as a male human being, is first and foremost that I'm a human being. Again, people often sort of ask me about what my philosophical or political orientation is. And frankly, I don't have a political orientation. I have an orientation to the well-being of the individual human being and that of human beings in society, that I want to see a much kinder, juster, equitable society. So if I start off by not accepting women, then I'm really in trouble. So I need to think about very clearly what my framework for myself and my relationships is really about. And I think that whilst I'm still stuck in a process of blaming, I don't see how I can heal. One of the first principles coming into therapy is that I've taken the step to acknowledge that I need to change, that I want to change. Why? Because in the place that I'm currently in, I am suffering in some way or another. Now, in therapy, very little happens if I keep focusing on my client's partner. There are some instances where I've got to educate my client that they're in a toxic relationship. There's no question of that. And yes, men do get harmed in toxic relationships. But I also need to take into account how I've let myself be harmed. And one of the things that we tend to do as men, often in relationships, we either get aggressive and we try to dominate and control our partner, or we surrender to our partner's inappropriate behavior. We become compliant and we give our partner, if they're engaging in poor behavior, permission to keep doing what they're doing, rather than me putting a line in the sand and going, enough's enough. This is unacceptable to me. It's hurtful. It is, unacceptable. Toxic behavior is unacceptable. So I need to take ownership for when I don't do that. So in the broader sense, I come back to this principle about really understanding how our relationships in our culture through this ideology of patriarchy has impacted on me as a man, and I have to take account for that. I have to be responsible. I have to take ownership for it, about changing myself. There is very little point in me directing and continuing to blame women or feminism. Because again, let me reiterate, feminism is about equality. And I don't necessarily, and I understand I've done a lot of reading of Jordan Peterson's material and I've watched endless YouTube videos of him. And although he's not explicitly disrespectful to women, he has a very patronizing approach when he's being interviewed by women. And I'll make that very, very clear. It's not what he says, it's how he says it. And some of those signals and messages are very, very subtle. Right? So unless we change our attitude towards the bigger picture, towards what sort of culture and society we want to have, wherein people are equal. I mean, a lot of talk is not just about gender, but it's also about racism. It's about using religion and science to justify one's superiority over another. And patriarchy is exactly that. One of the things that I find astonishing, maybe not so much, is that the more patriarchal the culture and the people in it are, the more likely we are going to have an us versus them attitude towards anybody who's different. In that environment, discrimination flourishes, blame flourishes. We see scapegoating of individuals, of groups, of cultures, of ethnicities, of religious people. Or in reality, in truth, what is the difference? I talk about if you cut me, I'll bleed red. If someone who's of another race cuts themselves, they bleed red. It's the common human denominator, not whether I'm male or female. There's different expressions of masculinity and femininity. But aren't we, in that context, just human beings? And in that essence of being human, we are equal. We should have the same access to free speech, to resources, to opportunities, without the fear of being censored or pillared or ostracized. Surely men and women should have the opportunity for economic and political participation in the same way as men traditionally have had. Because we've had it and we've owned it for all this time. And believe me, for the individual and collectively in society, there have been times when we've really sort of stuffed it up. And we continue to stuff it up. And when I watch societies that are trending more and more and more towards a traditional patriarchal system, the more discrimination and the more abuse and the more inappropriate and often criminal behaviour we can see. So as a male, and I've been through the process of examining my deep held beliefs and attitudes and feelings towards a lot of this, is I need to simply go, I need to reject that traditional attitude, that patriarchal attitude. And I need to adopt a humanistic, a human perception about our relationships and our culture. And where I want that to go, because, one of the things that I talk about for us, being good and great men is that we want to think about the legacy we leave for future generations. In my case, I'm already thinking about my grandkids and when they get to be adults and what culture and society will look like then. And right now, it's a scary proposition. Because the idea that somehow we are divided across, gender is flourishing again. This strong backlash towards the doubts about the benefits of feminism and the equality between the genders is just dangerous. Because it also raises up who's in charge of what So in the English-speaking countries, we sense a strong surge of, women having to struggle again for the rights over their bodies, over the decision-making over their bodies. In the United States, it's particularly evident with the constant threat of taking away women's rights over their bodies, both in terms of reproductive rights, but also in terms of other rights, biological rights. Now, that to me is absolutely unconscionable. It's a bit like someone saying to me, we're going to make decisions about your capacity to participate in reproduction, about what happens. And there are, issues in our legal system about the rights of the father and the rights of the mother and so on. I don't doubt that. And I've worked in this area for a long time, and I've had a lot of experience with helping people to both blend families but also help them to separate. And legally, it can get really, really, really messy. But if we come back to that whole idea of human beings as opposed to focusing on our, gender, then we're going to be able to resolve conflict much, much more productively, because it becomes one of us rather than us versus them. One of the things that I know that children really, really, really need to thrive when mum and dad no longer get on is that mum and dad can resolve their conflict in a way which doesn't disturb the child. In other words, don't make the kid the meat in the sandwich, because that's when you really are going to need some fairly serious psychological intervention to help that child deal with the trauma of the conflict between mum and dad. So the blaming aspect of this, the capacity to point the finger at someone else, needs to go. I, as a male, and I, as a female, will need to take ownership for my part in the problem and not blow it off. I need to be clear about how I can be part of the solution, and we are needing solutions in this space. As in men's health, we're still not doing very well. Our mental health issues are still appalling. We're prone to anxiety, depression, suicide. The suicide statistics continue to be a real concern to me. I deal with that on an everyday basis. I don't want to see that. Why should someone feel like they're alienated and isolated when all, in many respects, they need to do is to open up, reach out, and talk about what's happening to them? But traditional masculinity calls that a weakness. Step it up, man up, pull up your bootstraps, don't be a wuss. All those sort of derogatory observations about who we are when we're in pain have no place. I need to own my pain. I need to learn to live with it and then to change from that perspective. So I hope that clarifies some of the things. And yep, I accept that there's going to be lots of men who are going to go, this is bullshit. But I challenge you to think deeply about this. And you may not change your point of view, but I know lots of men are. Lots of men are coming into a space where they see this from a much clearer perspective. And it's not about maintaining the dichotomy, the binary perspective of who we are. We are human beings, and I can't stress this enough. We just happen to have different genders, different races, different religions, but it's about coming together. So let's work on coming together, because cooperation is ultimately what makes us as human beings succeed. In order for that to happen, we need to be able to respect each other for whatever there is. Now, I don't respect some people's behavior, but I respect them as a human being, and I will call them on their behavior. And this is where I'm calling on men, that I'm going to call you on your behavior about this. And that's a hard task, and it's a scary one, but that's what courage is about. Until next time, we'll pick up then. Take care.
Thank you, Gunter. And thank you for listening to Inspire Change with Gunter. Again, if you have any questions or comments or ideas for a show, you can email development@noirtainment.com. That's development@noirtainment.com. Thank you, and thank you for listening.
Love can take us higher. Love can take us so high.